In this video, we're going to learn how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring out the greatest common factor. So before we start solving equations by factoring out the greatest common factor, let's review what the greatest common factor actually is. So remember, a factor is something that evenly divides a number. So the numbers that we have, we're going to look for items that it is divisible by. Then greatest means it's the biggest factor. So we're factoring out every single value that they have in common. The biggest number of variables are coming out. That is our greatest factor. Now this word common means that they're going to have this greatest common factor in common. So if we look here at 8y to the 6th minus 14y to the 4th, we're looking for a greatest common factor, and this deals with both numbers and variables. So the first thing we need to look for is what is the greatest number in common that both 8 and 14 are divisible by. Now you can list out, okay, the factors of 8 are 1, 4, 2, and 8. Those are all of the numbers that 8 is divisible by. And then 14 is divisible by 1, 2, 7, and 14. Well, if I look at those, the greatest common factor that they have is 2. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically undistribute or factor out their greatest common factor number-wise, which is 2. Then from here I need to look at their variables, and what I notice is that they each contain at least 4 y's. So I'm going to factor out a y to the 4th. Now when I'm factoring something out, remember I'm basically undoing the distributive property. So I'm taking 2y to the 4th and I'm pulling it out in front. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. And I used up 4 of the y's, so I have 2 of them left. Then I have minus, 14 divided by 2 is 7, and the y to the 4ths cancel out. So notice here that when I factor out the greatest common factor, I'm basically undoing the distributive property. And if I were to distribute that 2 back in, I would go right back up here to my original expression. Then from here, if I look at the next example, I notice that I have 15 a to the 3rd and 21 a to the 2nd. Well, I notice that both of these, their greatest common factor is 3. So I'm going to factor out a 3, and because they're both negative, I'm actually going to factor out a negative 3. Then from here, I notice that they both contain at least 2 a's, so I'm going to factor out 2 a's. So I have negative 3a squared. Well, negative 15 divided by negative 3 is 5, and then there's 1a left, because I subtract the 3 minus 2. Negative 21 divided by negative 3 is a positive 7, and the a squareds cancel out. So again, I basically undid the distributive property here and rewrote this so the greatest common factor was pulled out in front of the parentheses. And if I were to distribute that greatest common factor back in, I would go right back to this original expression. Now we're going to solve these two equations below by using factoring out the greatest common factor and tying it together with the zero product property. So the first thing I want to do is I want to find the greatest common factor between 12x and 32x squared. And what I notice is their greatest common factor that they're both divisible by is 4, and then they each contain at least 1x. So if I undistribute that 4x, so that becomes 12 divided by 4 is 3, and the x's cancel out, plus 32 divided by 4 is 8, and there's 1x left, and that equals 0. Now notice here that I have an application of the zero product property because I have 4x times 3 plus 8x is equal to 0. I have a product that is equal to 0. So I can set each little part equal to 0 here. So I can set the 4x equal to 0, or I can set the 3 plus 8x equal to 0, because either one of those equaling 0 will result in that product being 0. So here if I divide by 4, I get x is equal to 0. Here I subtract 3. Then I divide by 8. So I find my other x value to be equal to a negative 3/8. So now looking at example 2, I'm looking for their greatest common factor. And here I notice their greatest common factor is 4. And then they each contain at least an x squared. So if I basically undistribute or factor out that 4x squared, 4 divided by 4 is 1, and the x squareds cancel out. plus 24 divided by 4 is 6, and there's still an x attached to that. So then from here I can see I have the zero product property because I have something times something is equal to 0. So I set each little part equal to 0. So here I would get divided by 4, x squared is equal to 0. Well, the only thing times itself that will equal 0 is 0 itself. So I have x equals 0. And then if I set the second part equal to 0, subtract 1. So I get 6x is equal to negative 1 divided by 6. I find that x is equal to a negative 1, 6. So I have my two values for x that will make that original equation true. So final two examples here. It's pretty much the same thing. The only thing is we're going to have to start by rewriting that equation so we have the equals 0. So if we're going to use the zero product property, we need to have the equals 0 part of that equation. So I'm going to start by subtracting 60y cubed from each side. So then I have 12y to the fourth minus 60y cubed is equal to 0. So now I have the 0 part of that zero product property. And now I need to get the product part. Well, the way to get the product part is to factor out the greatest common factor. So here I notice that both of these are divisible by 12 and they share a y cubed. So my greatest common factor is 12y cubed, and as I factor that out, that becomes 1y minus 5, and those y cubed cancel out. So now I have a product of something times something is equal to 0, so that's the zero product property. So I can set each part equal to 0. So I divide by 12 here, I get y cubed is equal to 0, and the only thing that times itself will give us 0 is 0 itself. So my first option is y equals 0. Second option here, I have 1y minus 5 equals 0, so we add 5 to each side. So the other option is y is equal to 5. Now if I look at example 2 here, remember that I need the equals 0 if I'm going to use any sort of factoring. So I start by subtracting 14a squared from each side. So I have 8a cubed minus 14a squared is equal to 0. Well, then from here, I have the 0 part of the zero product property, so I need to create a product. And I do that by factoring out the greatest common factor, which is 2a squared. So I factor out a 2a squared. That leaves me with 4a minus 7 is equal to 0. Well, now I have the zero product property because I have something times something is equal to 0. So I set each part equal to 0. Divide by 2. I know the only thing times itself that will give us 0 is 0 itself. So one option is a equals 0. The other option, we have 4a minus 7 could equal 0. We add 7 to each side, so I have 4a is equal to 7. Divide by 4. My other option is that a is equal to 7 over 4.